Every day, many children in South Africa are exposed to traumatic events that have a lasting psychological impact in their lives. The recent cases of violence, including a case of a woman who was kidnapped, robbed and then raped in front of her 10-year-old son inside a taxi in Johannesburg, and a woman who was attacked by another parent in the presence of children at a Spur restaurant, have once again forced South Africans to put the focus on how protected children are in dealing with these violent situations. To talk more on the issue, we're joined now in studio by Dr. Sats Cooper. He's the president of the International Union of Psychological Science. Good to have you. Thank you very much for being our guest.
Good morning.
All right, now we talk about things like this and psychological trauma. Just give us an idea and an understanding what psychological trauma actually is.
Well, it's an impact on how you react to situations. It impacts on your well-being. It impacts on your sense of reality. It impacts on every aspect of your life. There's no aspect of your being, physical, perception, behavior, that's not impacted. There are various symptoms that result, and these affect your work, your play, other aspects of your daily routine, and can stay with you for an inordinate amount of time and can impact on how you see the world much later.
Yeah. You know, we speak about some of these events, and perhaps we can talk about them individually, because both having exceptionally long-lasting and traumatic effects. I mean, take, for instance, this young boy gets into a taxi very innocently with his mother, and the next second this happens, he sees his mother being raped, and the violence that happens in society on an everyday basis. I mean, what kind of issues does this young boy have to deal with now?
Oh, serious issues, and if he does not get some intervention, psychological, serious intervention, this boy is going to be wounded for the rest of his life. Indeed, that memory will remain with him, and it's going to blight how he deals in the world. So he needs that help. If anything, the MEC who is here can do that's positive is ensure he gets the right degree of ongoing help, because we owe it to him. Adults in our society, people in leadership, have let our children down. We do not put our children first. Indeed, our children are subjected to ongoing violence like very few countries in the world. We have a state of anger, violence that's physically happening, and we see the images of it as if we were in a war situation. So it impacts on all areas of our lives. And it's good that the media picks up these incidents as they happen. But really, it's adults behaving terribly badly, people in responsibility, giving up the roles that they ought to uphold. If we look at how some of the leaders behave, somebody refusing to resign when he's asked to resign, what effect are those going to have on our kids? Our kids are not going to listen to their teachers in the classroom. And when the center doesn't hold, things fall apart, and everything goes all right.
So it's basically adults setting a very bad example. I mean, I know what you're referring to. You're talking Parliament, you switch on the channel, you see fighting of our leaders, people that set an example for us. Now, again, talking about fighting and setting examples, let's go back to the Spur incident. You've got two grown adults, and I mean, we've all been in the situation where our kids have had tiffs on the playground, we know that, but the way you deal with it is teaching a lesson to your children. But by going up to a table, banging this table, pulling a child by his arm, and screaming, swearing, and carrying on like that in front of children, I mean, again, what are we doing? How are we expecting this country to sort of move forward and be a peace-loving country when our parents are behaving this way?
Well, we're not a peace-loving country, and that's the sad fact. We have ongoing examples of violence, and unfortunately we'll be sitting here talking about this in another few years' time again, because nobody seems to care up there in authority, in education, in our public health system, leadership generally, whether in the public space or in the private space. We don't seem to be bothered about the levels and intensity and form of violence which is ongoing, which impact on our kids learn this, they get socialized into it, and they believe that That's how you respond to situations. Indeed, many of our kids growing up, the vast majority of them, probably don't know how to behave in situations like this because the examples they see are so deleterious to their health. So we need a very serious, radical change in how we treat of our kids, and that has to become a priority. Otherwise, this generation growing up, seeing the images on television, watching the news, being open to social media, is going to behave in that way, believing that it's normal behavior, because they don't see other behavior as a norm.
If I may talk about again, I mean, another news event. I mean, it's been an awful month when it comes to children being affected, and I want to talk about the after effects. I mean, here's another one, the 1-month-old baby who was allegedly kidnapped, and there was this big rush to find this beautiful baby whose photographs circulated around South Africa faster than I've ever seen anything happen. And then the baby was found, but only later to have basically been a pawn for his mother. I mean, you know, that was another story that really got us quite badly. But from what age are children affected? I mean, you think there's a 1-month-old baby, it's okay, the baby will, you know, won't remember this, but do they? I mean, does this scar them from what age?
Well, look, it's the trauma that happens from the womb and it continues to the tomb. And unless there's appropriate intervention along the way to show different ways of behaving, that person, that child will grow up believing and acting out some of the things that are unresolved in her or his life. So it impacts, if it impacts on adults in the way that some of these images and some of these stories have gone around, how much more with kids who actually don't have the psychological, intellectual, cognitive processes to work through these issues. They're going to be very confusing. Uncertainty, insecurity, an individual growing up feeling really anxious, and a variety of other responses, as many as the individuals are who are going to respond in different ways.
We're seeing a lot of different tips being put on screen at the moment of how to help your children cope with traumatic stress. You know, we do blame, we're here talking about maybe parenting and things that happen that we as parents see our children witnessing, but there are things that we don't see our children witnessing. What are the signs that we look out for traumatic stress within a child? For instance, if my kid goes to school, he's been traumatized by his teacher, he comes home, he's been threatened not to speak about it to me, and yet I need to look out for signs in case there is something wrong.
Anything out of the ordinary, something that tells us that this child is slightly different today or this afternoon, anything, whether it's a withdrawal, whether it's acting out, and it could be physical symptoms like bedwetting, for instance. So any of those, eating, not eating, overeating, a variety of symptoms that are peculiar for the individual. So we must be in tune with our kids. And when we realize a slight mood, a slight behavioral, attitudinal change, the things that the child usually engaged in, the child is not engaging in, those pleasurable activities the child is withdrawing from and not communicating or just over communicating. So it's a variety, it's a spectrum of reactions depending on individual circumstances. So we need really to know our kids to be able to help them and talk to them about it. We ought to be able to be the succor for our children. They ought to come unto us and say, look, this has happened. Even though there may be terrible bullying and threats out there in the external environment, our children should at least feel safe at home with the parents. But unfortunately, many of our parents engage in verbal, in physical and other behavior against each other, and there's abuse in the family. So what ought to be a haven then becomes a bastion for expressing such behavior.
One last issue that I need to talk about, because I'm seeing it getting very heated here on social media. There's a story of a young lady who, it's a young girl, I think it's a 14-year-old girl, and I'm gathering that there are actually two stories of uploading child pornography. It was a video that was taken and somebody uploaded it. It was a 14-year-old girl onto social media, and it's being shared on Facebook, shared on Twitter, and people are watching this in this society where social media is rife. I mean, again, this is another instant where it's the rights of a child that are being abused. I mean, firstly, this child shouldn't have done this, but that's not the story. It's people sharing it. And when it's available like this, you know, again, what do we do? I mean, this is a difficult situation.
You've got to question the people who pass this on. First of all, if I receive something like that, I ought to report it. I ought to make something about it, report it to the service provider and the criminal justice authorities, and our police need to wake up and become part of this world that we're part of, rather than ignoring such issues.
Absolutely.
Because if we continue that, what we're doing is we're secondarily traumatizing such people. We abusing that child, and through no fault of her own or his own, this stuff gets tweeted out there. This is the instant world that we're in.
Indeed.
And we ought to think differently. And for heaven's sake, our leadership needs to act.
And we need to take responsibility for our actions as well. And remember that this is a violation of the law. If you do go and share things like this, don't do it. Dr. Sats Cooper, President of the International Union of Psychological Science, thank you very much for talking to us here on the program. So much to unpack when it comes to what's happening in our psyche these days.